We're going to look at a familiar passage and episode in Jesus' life. And I'd like you to consider thinking about this differently. And again, nobody has to believe what I say. I'm asking you to think about it. It's the Last Supper. Jesus has worked his way from Galilee down into Judea, and into Jerusalem, and we know what's coming. In fact, he had to have known what was coming too. Yeah. So this happens at the Last Supper of all places, and I pick it up in John's Gospel where Jesus is talking about someone. Now the English, most of your English translations say betrayed. The Greek word paradidomi simply means to hand over. So translators said betrayed. But that, if you read that he hands him over, not that there isn't a sense of betrayal there, but it just literally means he hands him over. So anyway, Jesus says, they're asking who is it? And he says, well, it's the one whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. And then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. So Jesus told him, what you're about to do quickly. Now I want to begin by also saying, I believe there are many people in our culture that are disappointed in God and disappointed in Jesus, including many Christians. So let me having said that, develop this a little bit for your consideration. First of all, disappointment, we're told by experts, and you don't have to be an expert in psychology to recognize this, or sociology. Disappointment plagues our culture.
Amen.
We find every indication that, in fact, disappointment saturates our culture. Most of us people would love to enjoy the freedom and the material blessings that we have in America. Just having enough to eat each day would suffice hundreds of millions around the globe, when you consider that hundreds of children will starve to death today. How is it that the most prosperous nation on the face of the earth in all of history has such a high level of dissatisfaction and disappointed people? You ever think about that? Of the 156 nations surveyed, we rank 18th about people that claim they're satisfied. And by the way, every year we're getting further down the list. So more and more people in our culture are dissatisfied, are disappointed. Now, all religions teach that life is full of disappointments, especially Buddhism. Think of the type of things that disappoint people, or even disappoint you. Number one, I think, among many people on the list of disappointments is other people, especially marriage. People go into a marriage with high expectations, hoping for the best, but those relationships often end in great disappointment. They had hoped for something else. They'd hoped that this relationship, they'd hoped that this person was going to do something. They get disappointed, and many of those end up in either unhappy marriages or divorce. People can disappoint us, especially people that are close to us, because of our expectations. No, expectations are not wrong. High expectations are not wrong. By the way, did your parents ever disappoint you at any time? Another major source of disappointment, according to experts, is ourselves. Have you ever been disappointed in yourself over something that you did or failed to do?
Yep.
Things that are out of our control can disappoint us. The economy. The stock market disappoints people all the time, I hear. The weather. Stuff we buy disappoints us. You ever buy a car that you end up being disappointed in? You know, my first new car was a Chevy Vega. And my dad warned me. In fact, he wouldn't even co-sign for me. He says, don't buy that. They don't, you know, it's an aluminum engine. They don't know anything about it. I'm not going to co-sign for you. You know, so I got my buddy Ralph Martini, you know, who was working at McDonald's. At least he had a job, he could co-sign for me. I bought that Vega. I was happy, man. Got a new car smell. I thought I was a youth minister. I thought, hey, I'm going to save on gas mileage, you know, hauling kids around and stuff like that. I was still paying for that sucker when the engine burned up.
Yep.
How about sports teams?
Oh,
Go Bruins.
yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go.
I mean, man, come on. Teams.
Go somewhere.
Now, have you ever noticed that our expectations have a direct correlation to our disappointments?
Yeah.
So our expectations are directly connected to our disappointments.
Amen.
We live in a culture that encourages us to dream big, shoot for the stars. You can do anything you put your mind to. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but this is part of a culture that extols that rhetoric, and it's one of the most important values in our culture. And part of that, which ends up being a great source of disappointment, has to do with personal success. If you're told that this is the measure of success, and then you find that you're not measuring up to that, naturally, we've got a lot of dissatisfied, disappointed people in our culture. Because I didn't measure up to what the culture said I should have.
Yep.
And by the way, our culture usually measures personal success in materialistic terms. So we collectively measure the worth of an individual based upon her or his material success. How much money do they make? What do they own? What type of success do they have in business or in career? That, in our culture, is what? I'm talking about the car, by the way.
Success.
Yeah, it's a status symbol.
Either way.
It's a status symbol for our culture. I mean, if you drove into Church Park on that thing, Walter,
Yes.
I would be impressed.
Come on, mine's blue.
Yeah, right.
I mean, we're just automatically conditioned to be impressed with that. I mean, Walter could have just stolen it from, Rodeo Drive, but we don't even ask that question. We just see somebody in a status symbol like that, and we're impressed.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So we know how our culture works.
I think that
Now, again, one of the ironies of this cultural value, that it comes at a high cost, I would suggest that personal success, especially if it's measured in materialistic terms, should in no way be the primary indicator of the value of a person's life.
Amen.
But that's how our culture works.
Amen. Yep.
We just saw a billionaire who apparently sexually abused girls and other women. Before he was outed, he was automatically honored because of his financial success. He even palled around with some of the most powerful, important people in our culture. Why? Because he was wealthy. One of the highest rates of suicide in our nation belongs to young, highly educated, wealthy white men who at the top of their game take their own lives because they get there. They've been told by our culture, this is it. This is your measure of happiness, of your self-worth. They get there and they say what Rock Hudson said at the end of his life. Anybody remember what Rock Hudson said just before he died? No. Is this all there is?
What did he say?
Is this all there is? After being wealthy, famous, etc. What are your expectations in life? What are you expecting? Now be careful, because remember, it's going to be directly correlated to how you value yourself and any disappointment you have in life. What are your expectations for your own life? Now hopefully you've been thinking about this, and you've recognized that our culture is obsessed with monetary personal success. And that should in no way determine the value of your life. God does not value you that way. He values you for who you are. Wanting a nice job, a good home, a nice car, they're okay. But we should not be, especially as followers of Jesus, seduced into thinking that we're a loser and that we will never amount to anything if we don't have that type of material success. And we're constantly bombarded with it by every commercial we see. Now, what about expecting something else from our lives? What would it mean for our lives if we simply expected a major value of our life to do things the way Jesus did things? To treat people the way Jesus treated people? To treat people with fairness, with kindness, with compassion, based upon God's love. What would happen to our nation if America returned to those values? What if parents started to raise their children this way? Instead of so many, you've heard recently of wealthy people cheating to get their children into prestigious universities. What if they would have taught their children instead? It said that the real value of your life is not whether you go into Harvard or Stanford, but the way you treat other people. That's how you should measure success in your life.
Amen.
What if by example our nation started teaching and reinforcing this? What if the church returned to this? Teaching by example. Getting our children to recognize there's a greater value than material success. Our culture desperately needs to reestablish these expectations, to reestablish the value of life based upon how we treat one another. Now, would it be saying too much to expect of our lives that we treat people with kindness? You wouldn't be too disappointed, would you? You could have a lot of control over your life. I mean, the stock market could go anywhere. The economy could go anywhere. Your health could go anywhere. But if you expect in your life to treat people with kindness and fairness, then you're not going to be disappointed because you have some control over that.
That's right.
Your life will always be valuable, regardless of what happens around you.
Amen.
Now, if we set that as a good goal, along with our other goals, a good job, a nice house, a nice car, but if we put people first, if we put doing things the Jesus way, we would be happier as a culture, as a people.
Amen.
This is what we offer as a church, by the way. Now, we've seen our values inextricably connected to our expectations of life. And our expectations also determine whether or not we're going to experience disappointment or happiness in life. So let me close with this familiar scene in the Gospels at the Last Supper. As I mentioned, Jesus and his disciples had traveled down through Galilee into Judea to Jerusalem. They had this meal outside the city. It's Passover. Pilate had put hundreds of additional Jew-hating Roman soldiers in the city to prevent against a riot. Now recall this meal, like all meals in the ancient Near East, we call it the Last Supper. Jesus is gathered with his inner circle. These meals function like a social contract. In other words, if you accepted the invitation of the host, and the host of this meal is Jesus, you were committed to resolve all problems. You were to forgive and accept one another. You were to accept one another in a type of family partnership. Problems were to be resolved. It's no light matter. To have a meal like that was a commitment before God. I would suggest our meal is the same thing. It's not just a remembrance of what Jesus did. It's the same type of commitment to do things the Jesus way, to forgive. I think Burton's statement earlier is right in line with why we're here.
Amen.
It's part of what this gathering is and this meal is. Now, by the way, I'm not sure how Jesus knew, but he recognized Judas was not on board with his agenda. It was probably over the last 3 years he had been with this guy. They probably discussed and maybe even argued about Jesus' idea of establishing God's kingdom. Because Judas Iscariot was associated, before he came to Jesus, with a radical Jewish revolutionary group that says the only way we're going to establish God's kingdom is to kill those Romans. But he's hanging in with Jesus, and he's hanging in with Jesus, and they get to the Last Supper, and Judas is going to turn against him. I don't think to betray him for money. I think what Judas did in turning Jesus over, handing him over, was to try to force Jesus' hand to act against the Romans.
Amen.
To have a kingdom like Judas wanted, and many other Jews wanted. But Jesus wouldn't have any part of it. And so when Judas finds out it didn't go that way, he killed himself. I don't think he was in it for the money. I think he was in it because he was disappointed in Jesus' idea of what God wanted for the world. And he was going to force his hand. And it backfired.
Amen.
Now, by the way, I think there's a lot of Christians that are disappointed in Jesus. When you go to a lot of big churches, what you hear is the second coming. The second coming. I mean, Jesus is going to finally kick butt at the second coming. There are going to be thousands of dead people everywhere at Armageddon. Because the first coming was such a disappointment to him. Loving your neighbor, accepting other people. Got to camouflage that Jesus in the big show. That's Judas. That's Judas' treatment. The first coming is what counts. Where he laid down his life. He said, God establishes his kingdom through love and forgiveness and accepting one another. This is what's going to change the world. Another big battle ain't going to change this world.
No.
We've seen a lot of it. Are you disappointed?
Nope.
Are you disappointed in Jesus? Or God? Are you willing to go the Jesus route? To make your life, the expectation of your life, to treat people the way Jesus did. And to bring people to gather around the table of forgiveness as the true hope for not only our nation, but for this world. And in that, great joy, great hope, great peace. Think about it.
Amen.